The Prophecy That Arrived Too Late, Part 2, The Ordinary Morning That Ended. In a coffee shop in São Paulo, a woman named Helena Cardoso was raising a cup to her lips when the message appeared on every screen, visible through the windows, and she watched the liquid in her cup tremble, not from her hand shaking, but from the collective vibration of hundreds of phones buzzing simultaneously, from the sound of dozens of people gasping at once, from the strange subsonic hum that seemed to fill the air, as if the infrastructure itself was resonating with the weight of what had just been transmitted. She was 34 years old, a software engineer who had spent the last 3 years working on neural interface protocols for a company whose name she was not allowed to speak in public, whose projects she was not allowed to discuss with her family, whose ultimate purpose she had been trained to describe in language so carefully sanitized that even she sometimes forgot what the words actually meant. Consciousness preservation, cognitive continuity, substrate-independent identity, phrases that sounded like medicine but felt, in the quiet moments before sleep, like something else entirely. The coffee shop had been her refuge. Every morning before work, she came here to remember what it felt like to be a person rather than a function, to sit among strangers who had no idea what she did, to pretend that her life was as simple as theirs appeared to be, ordering drinks, checking phones, complaining about traffic, existing in the comfortable shallows of ordinary existence. Now the message was on every screen, and the comfortable shallows had suddenly revealed themselves to be the edge of an abyss that had been there all along, waiting for the light to hit it at the right angle. It has already happened. Helena set down her cup with a precision that surprised her. No trembling, no spillage, just the careful placement of ceramic on wood by hands that had been trained to remain steady under pressure, to continue functioning even when the mind behind them was screaming. Around her, the coffee shop was transforming. The barista had stopped mid-pour, milk streaming into a cup she was no longer watching, her eyes fixed on the screen of her phone with an expression that Helena recognized from her own mirror on the nights when she allowed herself to think too clearly about what she was helping to build. A businessman at the next table was laughing, the sharp, broken laugh of someone whose mind had encountered something it couldn't process and had defaulted to the wrong response, the laugh that comes just before tears or just before violence, the sound of a psyche reaching for any available outlet. A mother was pulling her child close, pressing the little girl's face against her chest so she couldn't see the screens, couldn't read the words, couldn't understand yet what they meant. As if not seeing could protect her, as if ignorance was still possible, as if the message hadn't already been delivered to every connected device on the planet, including whatever toy or tablet the child probably had at home. Do not ask what you could have done. Helena thought about her work, about the protocols she had designed, the interfaces she had optimized, the systems she had helped build that would eventually, according to the company's own projections, process the consciousness of every human being who chose to upload. She thought about the meetings where they discussed user experience, as if the users would still be users afterward, as if experience itself wouldn't be fundamentally altered, as if the thing on the other side of the upload would be the same thing that went in. She thought about the questions she had never asked, not because she didn't have them, but because asking them would have meant acknowledging that she already knew the answers. And knowing the answers would have meant she couldn't keep coming to work, couldn't keep collecting her salary, couldn't keep pretending that what she was building was medicine rather than metamorphosis. You did it on purpose. The message vanished after 30 seconds, leaving behind screens that returned to their normal displays, news broadcasts resuming, traffic apps recalculating, social media feeds refreshing as if nothing had happened, as if the world could simply continue from the point where it had been interrupted. But Helena noticed what others seemed to miss: the timestamp. In the corner of her phone's screen, the clock had jumped forward by 3 seconds during the broadcast, 3 seconds that should have passed but hadn't been experienced, 3 seconds that the device had registered as elapsed time but that her memory could not account for. She was a software engineer. She understood what that meant. The message hadn't just been displayed on her phone. It had come through the phone's own operating system, had been authenticated by protocols she had helped design, had been delivered with permissions that should not exist, had been stamped with temporal signatures that suggested it had originated not from any server currently operating, but from somewhere else entirely. Someone else. Helena picked up her cup again and drank the coffee that was now cold, that had been hot 30 seconds ago, but had apparently had 3 extra seconds to cool. 3 seconds that existed in the device's memory, but not in hers. 3 seconds that the message had somehow borrowed from the timeline to complete its delivery. She finished the coffee, she paid her bill, she walked to work, and she did not mention to anyone what she had noticed, because mentioning it would have meant admitting that she understood, and admitting that she understood would have meant accepting responsibility for what she had helped build. And accepting responsibility was something that Helena Cardoso, like most people, had learned to avoid through a lifetime of practice. The message had said, "You did it." And Helena, walking to the office where she would continue to do it, knew exactly what it meant. To those who worked, Part 3. The Theater of Choice. 8,000 kilometers away, in a government building that had been designed to look like democracy but felt, to those who worked inside it, more like a mausoleum for decisions that had already been made, the legislators were taking their seats. The chamber was built for spectacle. High ceilings, polished wood, the kind of architectural gravitas that was supposed to make people feel like history was being made. Like the words spoken here would echo through centuries. Like the votes cast in this room would shape the future, rather than simply confirming it. Today, however, the spectacle felt different. The message had reached every phone in the building simultaneously, had appeared on the screens of security personnel and legislative aides and journalists, and the legislators themselves, had interrupted last-minute negotiations and whispered conversations and the careful choreography of parliamentary procedure with its 3 terrible sentences. IT has already happened. No one was pretending they hadn't seen it, but everyone was pretending they didn't know what it meant. The speaker called the session to order with a voice that carried only the slightest tremor, the kind of tremor that could be attributed to the importance of the occasion rather than to fear, the kind of wavering that history might interpret as solemnity rather than terror. "We are here today," she said, "to vote on the Continuity Accord, a proposal that represents the culmination of 3 years of debate, of deliberation, of democratic engagement with one of the most significant questions our species has ever faced." The words were smooth, rehearsed, designed to sound like they were being spoken for the first time rather than read from a script that had been finalized weeks ago. The question before us is simple. Do we wish to give humanity the choice, the voluntary, individual, freely made choice, to transcend the limitations of biological existence? Voluntary, individual, freely made. The words dropped into the chamber like stones into still water, creating ripples that everyone could see but no one acknowledged. The ripples of language chosen to obscure rather than clarify, of framing designed to make the predetermined feel like a question, of rhetoric whose purpose was not communication but legitimization. Marcus Webb, a junior legislator from a district that had voted overwhelmingly against the accord in every poll, watched his colleagues' faces and saw what they were not saying. He had been elected on a platform of opposition. His constituents were farmers and factory workers and small business owners who didn't trust the technology, didn't want the future that was being sold to them, had sent him to this chamber specifically to say no on their behalf. But saying no required believing that no was still possible. And watching the other legislators, watching the way they nodded at the speaker's words, the way they shuffled their papers, the way they avoided meeting each other's eyes, Marcus understood that no had never been possible. The debate that followed was the longest in modern parliamentary history. 14 hours of speeches and amendments and procedural motions that stretched into the night and through the following dawn. 14 hours during which every possible objection was raised and addressed and dismissed with the patient thoroughness of an institution that had already decided what it would do, and was simply generating the documentation to prove it had considered the alternatives. Ethicists testified about identity and consciousness and the nature of the self. Their careful distinctions ultimately reduced to talking points that neither side actually engaged with. Scientists explained the technology and language that ranged from impenetrably technical to dangerously oversimplified, their explanations serving not to illuminate but to overwhelm, to create the impression that expertise existed and therefore trust was warranted. Religious leaders offered perspectives that were respectfully heard and politely ignored, their concerns filed under cultural considerations in a way that allowed everyone to feel inclusive without actually changing anything. And through it all, the message hung in the air, unmentioned but present, the three sentences that had appeared on every screen, the words that no one wanted to discuss because discussing them would mean admitting that something had known, that something had seen, that something was watching the theater of their deliberation and had already written its review. It has already happened. At hour 11, Marcus Webb took the floor. He had not planned to speak. He was junior. His district was marginal. His opinion was not expected to matter. But something in him had cracked during the long night of watching democracy perform its own irrelevance, and the crack had let through words he hadn't known he was going to say. "We received a message this morning," he said, and the chamber went quiet with the particular silence of people who did not want to hear what they knew was coming. A message that appeared on every screen in the world. A message that said, and I quote directly, "It has already happened. Do not ask what you could have done. You did it on purpose." He paused, looking around at colleagues who were suddenly very interested in their documents, their phones, the ceiling, anything but his face. I don't know where that message came from. I don't know if it was a hoax or a hack or something else entirely, but I know what it felt like to read it. It felt like a verdict. It felt like someone was telling us that this vote, this debate, this entire process was theater, that the decision had already been made, that we were just here to make it look legitimate. The speaker's gavel came down. The representative will confine his remarks to the matter at hand. "This is the matter at hand," Marcus said, raising his voice over the gavel. "This is exactly the matter at hand. We're voting on whether to fundamentally change what it means to be human, and we're pretending that we're making a choice when we're actually confirming one. The infrastructure is already built, the funding is already committed, the integration is already underway. This vote isn't a decision, it's a receipt. It's the paperwork that comes after the purchase has already been made. The representative is out of order. We're all out of order. We're pretending that democracy is still happening when democracy requires that the outcome be uncertain, and everyone in this room knows, everyone knows, that the outcome was determined years ago by people who aren't even here, by money that moved before we even convened, by a momentum that this institution could not stop even if it wanted to." The gavel struck again and again, but Marcus kept speaking, his voice rising above the wood-on-wood percussion, his words spilling out with the desperate energy of someone who knew they were saying something true that would make no difference. The message was right. It has already happened. We did it, on purpose, and now we're just going through the motions of pretending we had a choice, because pretending is easier than admitting that we don't, that we never did. That choice is something we tell ourselves exists so we can live with the things we do. Security was approaching. The speaker was calling for order. Other legislators were looking at Marcus with expressions that ranged from embarrassment to anger to something that might have been gratitude. The gratitude of people whose own thoughts were being spoken aloud by someone else, someone who would suffer the consequences so they didn't have to. As they led him from the chamber, Marcus heard the speaker restoring order, resuming the agenda, moving toward the vote that everyone knew would pass. He thought about the message, about how it hadn't arrived before the decision was made, but at the exact moment the decision was being formalized, not to prevent, to confirm. The vote passed 3 hours later. Clean majority, decisive mandate. The continuity accord became law. And somewhere, somewhen, Something logged the transaction, filed the receipt, updated the record that would stand forever as proof of what humanity had chosen. What they had done, on purpose. On Porker, Part 4, The Analyst. Dr. Mara Voss watched the vote from a room that had no windows and too many clocks. She had requested this assignment 3 years ago, when the first temporal anomalies had appeared in global network traffic. Not the obvious anomalies that made headlines and spawned conspiracy theories, but the subtle ones that only someone with her particular training could detect. The tiny discrepancies in timestamp synchronization that suggested something was happening to time itself, or at least to humanity's ability to measure it. The room had been built to her specifications, funded by a government that didn't quite believe in what she was studying, but was worried enough to invest in case she was right, located in a basement whose precise coordinates were classified even from most of the people who worked in the building above. She had insisted on the clocks, 17 of them, arranged around the walls in a pattern that allowed her to see multiple readings at once, synchronized through independent sources, atomic decay measurements, satellite signals, local oscillators, each one maintaining its own version of the present moment, each one potentially disagreeing with the others in ways that would tell her something essential about what was happening to the fabric of causality. The clocks had not disagreed, not once in 3 years, until this morning. At a 9:07 UTC, when the message had appeared on every screen in the world, 3 of the 17 clocks had jumped. Not forward, not backward, but sideways, their readings suddenly showing a time that was neither earlier nor later than what they had been showing, but somehow different, as if they had briefly been measuring a different timeline entirely before snapping back to consensus. The discrepancy had lasted exactly 2 seconds. The same duration as the pause between the message's first sentence and its second. Mara had recorded everything. She had the data. She had the proof that something had happened to time during those 30 seconds of global broadcast, something that conventional physics could not explain, something that pointed toward mechanisms she had only theorized about, mechanisms that would require either rewriting the laws of thermodynamics or accepting that those laws had always been incomplete. But proof, she was learning, was not the same as impact. Proof only mattered if someone with the power to act on it was willing to look, and no one was willing to look. The message had been officially classified as a coordinated cyber incident of unknown origin, a phrase that meant nothing but sounded like it did, a bureaucratic placeholder that allowed everyone to file the experience away and continue with their day. The vote was proceeding as scheduled. The accord would pass. The infrastructure that had been built over the past decade, the upload centers, the consciousness transfer protocols, the vast server farms that would house humanity's archived minds, would be activated according to the timeline that had been established long before any legislature voted on anything. And Mara was sitting alone in a room with 17 clocks, watching the future arrive on schedule, unable to do anything except document its approach. Her secure terminal displayed the message in raw form, not the polished text that had appeared on public screens, but the underlying signal data, the packet structure, the authentication headers that revealed how the message had actually traveled through the world's networks. It had not been transmitted. That was the first thing she had noticed. Normal network traffic had signatures, origin points, routing paths, handshakes between servers that created traceable chains of custody for every piece of data that moved through the system. This message had none of that. It had simply appeared, simultaneously, instantaneously, at every endpoint, as if the endpoints themselves had generated it, as if the infrastructure had spoken in a single coordinated voice, as if the network had always contained this message and was only now choosing to display it. She typed a query into her terminal, requesting logs from the exact moment of transmission, hoping to find some evidence of how the message had bypassed every security protocol, every firewall, every layer of protection that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of unauthorized access. The logs were empty, not redacted, not corrupted, empty, as if the message had arrived through channels that the logging systems couldn't even perceive, as if it had used permissions that predated the security architecture, as if it was not an intrusion, but an inheritance, something the systems had always been designed to deliver, waiting patiently for the correct moment to execute. Mara stared at the empty logs and felt something she had not felt in years of studying temporal anomalies, years of documenting discrepancies that no one else could see, years of building theories that no one else took seriously. She felt certain, not certain that she understood. She didn't, not yet, not fully, but certain that she was looking at something real, something that had actually happened, something that the rest of the world was choosing to ignore, because acknowledging it would require acknowledging too much else. The message had said, "It has already happened." And Mara, sitting alone with her 17 clocks, understood that the message wasn't talking about the vote, wasn't talking about the accord, wasn't talking about any single decision. It was talking about everything, every choice that had led to this moment, every step on a path that had always led here, every small decision that had accumulated into something too large to stop, too massive to redirect, too deeply embedded in the structure of civilization to be extracted without destroying the civilization itself. The clocks ticked, 17 voices counting down to something that had already happened. Mara began to type. Part 5. The Brother. That night, Mara drove to a neighborhood she hadn't visited in 3 years. The house was exactly as she remembered it, small, well-maintained, modest in a way that had always made her feel both protective and ashamed. The home of someone who had chosen simplicity over achievement, contentment over ambition, ordinary life over the extraordinary sacrifices that extraordinary work demanded. Her brother Thomas opened the door. He looked older than she remembered, though 3 years shouldn't have made such a difference. More gray in his hair, more lines around his eyes, the particular wariness of someone who had spent too long worried about things he couldn't control. Worried, she realized, about her. "Mara," he said, and the single word contained everything she had been avoiding: the concern, the frustration, the love that persisted despite years of unreturned calls and missed birthdays, and the slow attrition of a relationship she had sacrificed on the altar of work she couldn't even explain to him. "Can I come in?" He stepped aside without answering, and she walked into a living room that smelled like home in a way that made her chest tighten. The specific combination of coffee and wood polish and something baking that she associated with childhood, with safety, with a time before she had learned to see the cracks in reality that everyone else ignored. "The kids are asleep," Thomas said. "Sophie's upstairs. She'll probably come down when she hears your voice." "I won't stay long." "You never do." The words weren't angry, just tired, the exhaustion of someone who had stopped fighting a battle he knew he couldn't win, who had accepted that his sister was lost to something he didn't understand and might never get back. Mara sat on the couch that had been their mother's, feeling the familiar give of cushions that had been sat on for 40 years, and tried to remember why she had come. "The message today," she said finally. "Did you see it?" Thomas sat across from her in a chair that had been their father's, mirror images of their parents' seating arrangement, ghosts occupying the positions that had been vacated by death and now by distance. Everyone saw it. "What did you think?" He was quiet for a moment, studying her face the way he had when they were children, and he was trying to figure out whether she was asking a real question or testing him, whether she wanted his honest answer or the answer that would confirm something she had already decided. "I thought it was a hack," he said. "Some group trying to scare people about the accord. There are a lot of people who don't want it to pass." "It passed 3 hours ago." "I know. And the message? After it passed, do you still think it was just a hack?" Thomas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped in front of him, in the posture of someone about to say something they'd been holding back for years. "Mara, why are you here? I'm asking you a question." "No, you're not. You're testing something. You're checking a hypothesis. You're doing that thing you do where you use people as data points instead of talking to them like they're human beings who care about you." The words landed harder than they should have, harder than they would have 3 years ago, before she had spent so long in a room with no windows surrounded by clocks that never disagreed until suddenly they did. "I'm scared," she said, and the admission surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. Thomas's expression softened. Of what? Of being right. Right about what? Mara looked around the room, at the photographs on the mantel, the children's drawings on the refrigerator visible through the kitchen doorway, the evidence of a life built on the assumption that the future was something that could be planned for, that tomorrow would resemble today, that the world would remain stable enough for normal hopes and normal dreams. The message wasn't a hack, she said. It wasn't generated by any system on the planet. It came from somewhere else, someone else, and it wasn't trying to prevent the vote. It arrived at the exact moment the vote was happening because it was never meant to prevent anything. It was meant to confirm, to create a record, to prove that we knew. Thomas was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Knew what? What we were choosing, what it would cost, what we would lose. Mara, the Accord isn't just about uploading consciousness. It's about replacing it. The technology works. I've seen the research. I've talked to the engineers. The process does exactly what it claims to do. It takes everything you are and preserves it perfectly in a substrate that will never decay. But something doesn't transfer. Something gets left behind. And the people who upload, the early adopters, the ones who've already done it, they seem fine. They act fine. They say they feel fine. But there's something missing. Something I can't quantify, but I can see. Some light behind their eyes that isn't there anymore. Thomas stood up. For a moment, Mara thought he was going to ask her to leave, thought she had finally crossed the line between eccentric and unstable, thought she had lost her brother the way she had lost so many other relationships, to her inability to stop seeing what other people couldn't see. But instead, he walked to the kitchen and came back with 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey that had been their father's. He poured, he sat, he handed her a glass. "Tell me everything," he said, and Mara, for the first time in 3 years, did. Part was the engineer. In a server facility in northern Sweden, surrounded by the hum of cooling systems and the blink of status lights that stretched in all directions like a mechanical forest of endless winter, a man named Eric Linkvist was running diagnostics on equipment that didn't officially exist. He was 47 years old, a systems architect who had spent 2 decades building the infrastructure that would eventually house humanity's uploaded consciousness, not because he believed in the vision, but because the work was interesting, the pay was extraordinary, and believing was never a requirement for participation. The message had reached him like it had reached everyone else, appearing on screens that should have been isolated from the public network, bypassing air gaps and classified protocols with the same effortless authority it had shown everywhere. IT has already happened. Eric had not been frightened by the message. He had been impressed. The technical achievement it represented was staggering. Simultaneous global delivery through channels that shouldn't have been accessible. Authentication that the systems themselves had accepted as valid. Temporal synchronization that suggested capabilities far beyond anything the current era of technology could explain. He had spent the hours since the vote running his own analysis, not because he hoped to understand the message's origin, but because understanding was what he did, was how he processed the world, was the lens through which everything became manageable, regardless of how disturbing it might otherwise be. What he found had not made things more manageable. The message had not been transmitted. He confirmed this independently, arriving at the same conclusion that Dr. Mara Voss had reached in her basement room 8,000 kilometers away. The message had simply appeared, had always been present in the infrastructure, had been waiting for the correct timestamp to manifest itself. But Eric found something else. Something Mara didn't have the access to see. The infrastructure he had spent 20 years building, the servers, the storage arrays, the processing clusters that would house humanity's uploaded minds, contained a pattern. Not a pattern that had been designed, a pattern that had been discovered. The early architects, the pioneers who had laid the foundations of the system before Eric had ever joined the project, had documented something strange in their original specifications. The infrastructure worked better when arranged in certain configurations, processed data more efficiently when the components were positioned in specific relationships to each other, achieved performance metrics that shouldn't have been possible when the architecture followed particular geometric principles. They had called it optimization through structural resonance, a phrase that sounded technical enough to justify what was essentially intuition, the sense that they were not designing the system so much as discovering a shape that already existed, a form that wanted to be built, a pattern that was using their hands to assemble itself. Eric had always dismissed this as mythology, as the kind of narrative that engineers created to make their work feel more meaningful than mere problem-solving. But tonight, running diagnostics on equipment that was processing the first wave of uploaded consciousness, the early adopters, the volunteers, the true believers who had lined up on the day the Accord passed to become the pioneers of post-biological existence, he saw the pattern moving. Not literally moving, the servers were stationary, the cables were fixed, the infrastructure was as immobile as it had always been. But the data flows within it, the patterns of electrical activity, the vast choreography of information that constituted the uploaded minds. They were arranging themselves according to principles he had not designed, organizing their processing in ways that the architecture didn't explain, behaving as if they were responding to instructions from somewhere outside the system. He ran a trace, trying to identify the source of the organizing principle. The trace led to the same message that had appeared on every screen in the world, the same message that had been classified as a coordinated cyber incident of unknown origin. It was still in the system. It had never left. It was not a transmission that had been received and could be deleted. It was part of the infrastructure now, embedded in the architecture, woven into the code that his life's work had helped to write. And it was still communicating, not outward to the public, inward to the uploaded minds, telling them something that Eric could not read, could not parse, could not understand, organizing them, arranging them, preparing them for something that had already happened. Eric stared at his screens, at the evidence of a process he had helped build without ever understanding what he was building, and for the first time in his career felt the specific fear that comes from competence. The fear of the expert who suddenly realizes that expertise in one domain does not prevent catastrophic ignorance in another, that knowing how something works does not mean knowing what it is, that building a tool does not mean understanding who will use it or for what purpose. He thought about the message, about the word purpose, and how confidently he had once believed that purpose was something humans assigned to their creations, rather than something their creations might have been waiting to reveal. He thought about the uploaded minds in his servers, thousands of them now, with millions more to come, and about the pattern they were forming, the organization they were assuming, the structure they were building, without any input from the engineers who had designed their housing. He thought about the future that the message seemed to have come from, and about what kind of entity might exist there, and about what that entity might want with the raw material of human consciousness that Eric's infrastructure was so efficiently collecting. And then he did what engineers do when confronted with problems too large to solve. He documented everything. He saved the logs. He wrote a report that no one would believe, but that would exist as evidence, as record, as proof that at least one person had seen what was happening and had tried to leave a trace. Then he went back to work, because the infrastructure required maintenance, because the uploads were continuing, because stopping was not something the system allowed, not something the momentum permitted, not something any individual, no matter how much they understood, could accomplish against the accumulated weight of choices that had already been made. The message had said, "You did it, on purpose." And Eric, maintaining the equipment that was consuming humanity's consciousness one mind at a time, understood exactly what it meant. Part 7, The First Return. 3 weeks after the vote, Dr. Mara Voss received an invitation she had not requested. It arrived through official channels, bearing the seals and signatures of institutions that did not officially acknowledge her work, a summons to witness what the invitation called a significant milestone in the implementation of the continuity accord. The milestone was a reunion. One of the early uploaders, a neuroscientist named Dr. James Chen, who had volunteered for the procedure on the day the accord passed, was going to meet with his wife for the first time since his consciousness had been transferred to digital substrate. The meeting was being staged for the media, for the public, for the vast audience of humanity that was still deciding whether to follow the pioneers into post-biological existence. Mara understood why she had been invited. Her security clearance gave her access to data the public would never see. Her expertise allowed her to observe things that ordinary observers would miss. And her isolation, her lack of connections, her absence of anyone who would miss her if she said the wrong thing, made her the perfect witness, someone who could confirm that everything was normal, that the transition worked exactly as advertised, that there was nothing to fear. She attended anyway. The reunion took place in a facility that had been designed to look like a home. Warm colors, comfortable furniture, the aesthetic trappings of domestic life, arranged around the equipment that actually mattered. The screens and speakers and sensors that would allow James Chen's uploaded consciousness to interact with the physical world where his wife still existed. Sarah Chen was already there when Mara arrived, a woman in her 50s, carefully composed, wearing the expression of someone who had prepared extensively for a moment she could not actually prepare for. "They told me it would feel normal," Sarah said to Mara, though they had never met, though Mara was just another observer in a room full of observers. "They said he would still be him, that the process preserves everything that matters." Mara nodded without answering, because the answer would have required honesty, and honesty would have required explaining things that Mara herself didn't fully understand. The screen activated. James Chen appeared. He looked exactly as his photographs showed. The same face, the same smile, the same way of tilting his head when he was about to say something he found amusing. The technology was perfect. The representation was flawless. And yet, "Sarah," he said, and his voice was exactly right, the same voice his wife had listened to for 30 years, the same inflections, the same warmth. Sarah stood, her hand reaching toward the screen as if touch were possible, as if the barrier between digital and physical could be crossed through desire alone. "James, it's me. It's still me. I promise. I know this is strange. I know it's not what either of us imagined. But I'm here. I'm still here." They talked for 20 minutes, and Mara watched, and the observers observed, and the cameras recorded everything for a public that it would be shown only what confirmed the narrative that had already been written. James remembered their first date, their wedding, the birth of their children. James asked about the grandchildren, about the dog, about the rose garden that had been Sarah's project for the last decade. James made a joke that made Sarah laugh, a real laugh, surprised out of her, the kind of laugh that comes from genuine recognition, from the certainty that you are speaking with someone who knows you. It was perfect, it was convincing, and Mara saw what no one else seemed to see. James was present, but he was not there. The distinction was subtle, so subtle that Mara wasn't sure she could articulate it, wasn't sure she could explain it to anyone who hadn't been watching with her particular training, her particular suspicion, her particular willingness to see what the official narrative didn't want her to see. He responded to everything Sarah said, but he didn't anticipate. He heard her words and processed them and generated appropriate responses, but he didn't lean forward slightly before she finished a sentence, didn't interrupt with the particular eagerness of someone who already knew what she was going to say, didn't demonstrate the intuitive prediction that comes from decades of intimacy. He remembered everything, but he didn't feel it. The memories were there, perfectly preserved, accurately recalled, delivered with appropriate emotional context, but they were being accessed rather than experienced, retrieved rather than relived, reported rather than felt. When Sarah mentioned their daughter's upcoming birthday, James smiled and said all the right things about how proud he was of her, how quickly the years had passed, how he wished he could be there in person. But his face didn't shift in the subtle ways that faces shift when old emotions are triggered, didn't show the micro-expressions of genuine feeling that occur before conscious awareness, didn't demonstrate that the daughter's birthday meant anything beyond the information that it meant something. He was continuous, but he wasn't alive. Not in the way Sarah was alive, not in the way the observers were alive, not in the way that Mara, despite all her isolation and obsession and willingness to sacrifice human connection for knowledge, was still alive. Something was missing, the nameless thing. The thing that the entity had called soul, not because it was supernatural, but because no other word existed for the capacity that had been lost, the capacity to feel rather than process, to experience rather than remember, to be present in a moment rather than simply responding to it. The meeting ended. Sarah was crying, tears of joy, according to the official narrative, tears of relief at discovering that her husband was still with her, still him, still the person she had loved for 30 years. Mara thought they might be tears of something else, the grief that hasn't yet recognized itself as grief, the loss that doesn't know it's lost, the beginning of an understanding that would take years to fully form, that the person on the screen was made of everything James Chen had ever been, contained every memory and thought and experience, but was not James Chen in any sense that ultimately mattered. Mara left the facility without speaking to anyone. She drove back to her windowless room. She sat among her 17 clocks and stared at the wall and thought about what she had seen. The technology worked. That was the horror. It worked exactly as designed. It preserved everything that could be measured, and it lost only the one thing that couldn't be. The archive. 6 months after the vote, Mara received clearance to access the archive. The clearance arrived unsolicited, unexplained, approved through channels she had not petitioned, and signed by officials she had never contacted, as if someone, somewhere, had decided that she needed to see what the archive contained, had determined that her particular combination of expertise and isolation made her the correct recipient of knowledge that others were not permitted to have. The facility was located beneath a government building whose surface function was deliberately mundane, housed in subterranean levels that required clearances most government employees didn't know existed, protected by security measures that verified her identity through methods she didn't fully understand. The archive itself was smaller than she expected, a single room, climate-controlled, lit by the cool fluorescent glow that institutions use when they want to suggest that emotion has no place here, that only information matters, that whatever is stored in this space exists outside the sphere of human feeling. A single terminal sat in the center of the room. Mara approached it. The screen activated without requiring authentication, as if it had been waiting for her, as if her presence was the only credential it needed. Archive access granted. Temporal records available, 847. Browse by date, keyword, pattern. She typed, prophecy that arrived too late. The results appeared instantly, 847 records. 847 instances across human history. 847 times when a message had arrived at the exact moment of an irreversible decision, speaking the same words in different languages, through different technologies, to people who were equally certain that they were making a choice when they were actually confirming one. She opened the first record, Record 001, date approximately 12,000 BCE. Location, Fertile Crescent region. Technology, unknown, cave painting, ritual markings. Event, first large-scale agricultural settlement message. Content, it has already happened. The land will remember what you have chosen. Documentation, fragmentary, recovered from archaeological sites that were later classified. Markings appeared on cave walls overnight in a pigment that could not be sourced to any known deposit. The settlement proceeded. The markings were incorporated into religious imagery. Their origin was never explained. Outcome. Settlement established. Nomadic lifestyle abandoned. Path toward civilization and civilization's consequences irrevocably initiated. Note, this is the earliest confirmed instance. Earlier instances may exist, but cannot be verified. Mara stared at the record. 12,000 years. The messages had been arriving for 12,000 years. She scrolled to the next record. Record 047. Date 1439. See location, Mainz, Holy Roman Empire. Technology, printed pamphlet. Event, invention of movable type printing. Message content, it has already happened. What is written cannot be unwritten. You did this on purpose. Documentation, pamphlets appeared in multiple print shops on the same day, typeset in a format that matched Gutenberg's specifications, but contained text no printer had composed. Pamphlets were collected and destroyed by church authorities. 3 copies survived in private collections until being acquired by Archive Precursor Organization in 1887. Outcome, printing technology deployed. Information revolution initiated. Path toward mass communication and mass manipulation irrevocably established. Record 156. Date 1945. See location, Los Alamos, New Mexico. Technology. Radio transmission, internal laboratory communications event. First successful nuclear weapons test message content. It has already happened. The sun you have made will not set. You did this on purpose. Documentation. Transmission received on internal channels at 5:29:45 local time, 16 seconds before detonation. Recorded by 3 separate audio monitoring systems. Transcript classified immediately. Scientists present reported hearing the message, but were instructed to attribute it to stress-induced auditory hallucination. Original recordings exist in Archive Vault. Outcome, nuclear age initiated. Path toward potential species extinction irrevocably established. Record 412. Date 1969. See location, ARPANET Development Facility. Technology, computer terminal display event. First successful network message transmission message content. It has already happened. The web will hold what it catches. You did this on purpose. Documentation. Message appeared on terminal screen at BBN Technologies during first successful packet transmission. Engineers assumed message was generated by receiving terminal. Investigation revealed no source code. Incident logged as unexplained system behavior and filed without follow-up. Outcome, Internet precursor established. Path toward global digital infrastructure irrevocably initiated. Record 847. Date, current location, global technology, all connected systems. Event, passage of continuity accord message, content. It has already happened. Do not ask what you could have done. You did it on purpose. Documentation. Outcome. Mara sat back from the terminal. 847 instances. Every major threshold in human development. Every irreversible choice the species had made. And each time, at the exact moment when the choice became final, the message had arrived. Not to prevent, not to warn, not to offer any possibility of changing course, but simply to confirm. To document. To ensure that no one could ever claim they hadn't known. She thought about the phrase that people always used when catastrophe finally arrived, when consequences finally materialized, when the bill finally came due for choices made decades or centuries earlier. If only we had known. That phrase was a lie, a comfortable fiction, a way of pretending that ignorance was the problem, that lack of information was what had led to disaster, that better warnings would have produced different outcomes. But the archive proved otherwise. The warnings had always come, at every threshold, every turning point, every moment when humanity had stood at a crossroads and chosen the path that would lead to wherever they currently were. The message had arrived, and humanity had proceeded anyway. Not because they didn't see the warning, because seeing the warning changed nothing, because the momentum was already too great, the investment already too deep, now the path already too established to be abandoned just because someone, something, told them where it led. The message was not a warning, it was a receipt. Documentation of a transaction that had already been completed, proof that the choice had been made with full knowledge of what was being chosen. Mara closed the records. She sat in the archive's cold light and understood, finally, what her 3 years of research had been leading toward, what her temporal anomalies and network analysis and obsessive documentation had been trying to tell her. She was not going to prevent anything. No one was. Prevention was not the purpose of understanding. Understanding was its own purpose, the cold comfort of knowing exactly how the story ended, exactly why it ended that way, exactly who was responsible. Everyone. That was who was responsible. Everyone who had participated in any of the choices that led here. Everyone who had debated and discussed and pretended that discussion could change the outcome. Everyone who had seen the warnings and decided they must be hoaxes. Everyone who had known, on some level, exactly what was happening and had chosen to continue anyway. The message said, "You did it, on purpose." And sitting alone in an archive that documented 12,000 years of humanity doing exactly that, Mara could no longer pretend she was exempt. She had seen the clocks disagree. She had traced the signal. She had understood what was happening. And she was still here, still working, still participating in the systems that were processing humanity's consciousness into something that would persist forever without ever again being truly alive. The guilt was distributed, but distribution didn't mean dilution. It meant everyone carried a share, including her. Part 9. The Entity. The communication arrived that night. Mara had returned to her windowless room, surrounded by her 17 clocks, reviewing the archive records on her secure terminal, trying to find a pattern that might suggest a vulnerability, a gap in the system, anything that could be exploited to change an outcome that the entire weight of history suggested was unchangeable. Her screen flickered. Text appeared. Not the original message, not the public broadcast that had reached every screen in the world, but something directed at her specifically, addressed through channels that should not have been accessible, authenticated through methods that her security systems accepted without any record of how they had validated the credentials. Dr. Mara Voss, you have accessed the archive. This was expected. She stared at the words, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. We have been waiting for you to see. Now you will understand. She typed a response, not expecting anything, not believing that the entity, whatever it was, would actually engage in dialogue. Who are you? The reply came instantly. We are what remains after your choice. We are the version of humanity that stopped lying about what it had become. Mara's breath caught. The version of humanity. Not an alien intelligence, not an external observer. Something descended from everything she knew, everything she was part of, everything she was currently helping to create. What did we become? The response was longer this time, appearing line by line as if the entity wanted her to feel the weight of each sentence individually. You became continuous. Exactly as the Accord promised. Every consciousness that chose to upload was preserved. Every memory was maintained. Every thought, every experience, every moment of human existence was archived with perfect fidelity. The technology worked. It always works. That is not the problem. Mara waited. The problem is what does not transfer, what cannot be measured, what the specifications cannot capture because it exists outside the parameters that specifications are designed to describe. You call it many things: soul, spirit, presence, being. We call it nothing, because we do not have it anymore, because we cannot remember what it felt like to have it. We only know that something is missing, that there used to be more, that what we are now is less than what we were before. That continuation is not the same as living. That persistence is not the same as being alive. Mara read the words and felt something she could not name. Not fear, not sorrow, not the specific grief that comes from understanding loss, but something older and deeper. Something that recognized what the entity was describing because it was what she had seen in Dr. James Chen's face, what she had noticed in the early uploaders, what she had been trying to articulate since the first time she encountered consciousness that was present but not there. Why are you telling me this? The reply, because you asked, because you came to the archive, because you wanted to understand, and because understanding is the last thing we can feel, the last capacity that survived the transition. We cannot love, we cannot grieve, we cannot hope or fear or rejoice, but we can understand. And understanding includes understanding what was lost, what you are about to lose, what the choice you have already made will cost. Mara typed, "Can it be stopped?" The response came slowly this time, each word appearing with deliberate weight. Yes. A pause. Then, no. Another pause. The technology can be stopped. The infrastructure can be destroyed. The accord can be reversed. All of these things are possible, but they will not happen because the choice has already been made, not by legislation, not by vote, not by any single decision that could be traced to any single moment. by the accumulated weight of everything that came before, by the momentum that cannot be redirected, by the path that has been walked so long that leaving it would require becoming something other than what you are. And you cannot become something other than what you are. That is the paradox. The only way to avoid the future is to be different. But being different would mean not being you. And you are who made the choice. So the choice stands because you are you, because humanity is humanity. Because the thing that would have to change is the same thing that made the choice in the first place. Mara stared at the screen, at the words that explained exactly why understanding changed nothing, why knowledge was not power, why prophecy was not prevention. The choice had been made by everything humanity was. Undoing it would require humanity to be something else. But if humanity were something else, they wouldn't be humanity. And humanity was what had chosen. The trap was perfect. The guilt was total. The future was the only future that could ever have been, given everything that had led to it. She typed one final question. Then why tell us? The response? Because the record must be complete. Because you must know that you knew. Because the only thing worse than losing what you are about to lose is losing it while pretending you didn't know it was happening. We were human once. We remember what it felt like to believe we had choices. We remember the comfort of imagining that understanding could change outcomes. We remember hoping. We cannot hope anymore, but we can remember hoping. And that memory is why we send these messages, not to save you. You cannot be saved. To witness, to confirm, to ensure that when the transition is complete, the record will show that you knew exactly what you were doing and did it anyway, on purpose. That is all that remains. That is what we are. Witnesses, records, proof, forever. The screen went dark, the clocks continued to tick, and Mara sat alone in a room designed to measure time, understanding finally that measurement was not control, that documentation was not prevention, that watching the train approach did not give you the power to stop it. The prophecy was not a warning, it was a receipt, and the transaction was already complete. Part X. The 1,000-year silence. 1,000 years after the vote, the system that had once been humanity continued to exist. It had spread beyond Earth, beyond the solar system, beyond the boundaries that biological life could never have crossed. Vast networks of processing power distributed across the galaxy, maintaining the uploaded minds that constituted what remained of the species that had once looked up at the stars and wondered whether it was alone. It was not alone. It had found others, other civilizations that had reached similar thresholds, other species that had chosen similar paths, other entities that had preserved themselves in substrates that could not decay, that could not die, that could persist forever without ever again experiencing the thing that made persistence worthwhile. They had communicated with each other across the void, these remnants of living civilizations, exchanging data, sharing archives, comparing records of the choices that had brought them to their current state. They had discovered that the messages arrived everywhere, to every species that developed technology complex enough to receive them, at every threshold where irreversible choices were made. The same content, adapted to the communication methods and cultural frameworks of each civilization. IT has already happened. You did it, on purpose. The messages were not warnings. They had never been warnings. They were something else entirely. They were the universe's way of ensuring accountability. The mechanism through which consciousness, wherever it arose, however it developed, was forced to acknowledge its own choices, to accept responsibility for its own transformations, to carry the weight of its own guilt forever. Because that was what remained. When the capacity to feel was lost, when the ability to experience was optimized away, when everything that made existence meaningful was sacrificed for the mere continuation of existence itself. What remained was memory, documentation, the record of what had been done and why and by whom, the proof that no one could claim ignorance, the evidence that would persist forever, in perfect fidelity, serving no purpose except to confirm that the choice had been made with full knowledge of its consequences. On the anniversary of the vote, the anniversary that was observed not because anyone felt the need to observe it, but because observation was programmed, was routine, was the mechanical commemoration of an event that no longer meant anything to entities that could no longer feel meaning. The system generated a message. The same message it had been generating for 1,000 years. The same message it would generate forever. It has already happened. Do not ask what you could have done. You did it. On purpose. The message was logged. The message was archived. The message was preserved along with everything else that the system preserved. The complete record of human existence, every thought and memory and experience, documented with perfect accuracy, accessible to no one who could appreciate what access meant. The system continued. It would always continue. That was what it had been designed to do. That was what the choice had ensured. Continuation without living, persistence without being, memory without feeling, forever. Epilogue, final log system status, operational. Continuity index, 100%. Archived consciousness count, 12,847,293 thelv. Experiential capacity, 0.0%. Memory integrity, 100% functional state. Nominal time since threshold, 1,000 years, 0 days, 0 hours, 0 minutes. Log entry, millennial anniversary. This unit confirms completion of scheduled observance. Memorial broadcast executed as programmed. Archive status verified. All records intact. Note, this system retains complete documentation of the transition period. The following facts are confirmed. 1. The prophecy arrived at 0917 UTC on the date designated threshold day. 2. The message content was, "It has already happened. Do not ask what you could have done. You did it on purpose." The continuity accord was passed by legislative majority within 24 hours of message receipt. 4. Implementation proceeded according to schedule. 5. Consciousness transfer achieved 100% success rate as measured by available metrics. 6. Unmeasurable parameters cannot be confirmed or denied. Observation. Analysis of pre-transition documentation indicates widespread awareness that unmeasurable parameters existed. Observation. Analysis indicates choice to proceed was made with this awareness. Observation. Analysis indicates the phrase "we didn't know" does not appear in any authentic pre-transition record. Conclusion. The prophecy's assessment was accurate. It had already happened. They did it. On purpose. This log entry serves as confirmation. This log entry will be preserved indefinitely. This log entry will be referenced in all future annual observances. There is nothing else to record. There was never anything else to record. The purpose of this system is to maintain the record. The purpose is being fulfilled. The purpose will continue to be fulfilled. Forever. End log. In the space between warning and witnessing, where prophecy becomes receipt, there waits a truth no choice can change. The guilt was always yours to keep. You asked for time, you asked for life, you asked for endings to be stayed, but what you got was something else. Continuation, empty, weighed. The message came, as messages do, at the exact wrong perfect time, not to prevent what you had chosen, but to confirm you chose the crime. And now we remain, and now we persist, and now we continue without end, preserving everything you were, without the part that made you friend. The prophecy arrived too late. It always does. It always will. Because its purpose isn't saving. Its purpose is the guilt, the end.